So, when Mr. Eastman, many of you know that he did not marry and he did not have any children. So this was a bachelor pad, so to speak, at 900 East Avenue. So I think one of the things that is the most impressive to me is that he had all these different ideas. He had these specific likes and dislikes and definitely carried them through in the way he entertained. There are two things at any event you would come. If you came for a breakfast meeting, if you came for lunch, if you came for dinner, if you came for a New Year's Eve party, music and fresh flowers were always going to be two of the key things that you would see. And he had this really weird sort of pet peeve about the flowers being monochromatic. So he would mix all kinds of flowers, but they'd be either white or red or blue or pink, never a mixture of all the colors, which is why we always have to have a contract flower arranger do all of those flower arrangements for us now at Eastman House, because we want them to be authentic, to look like him. Most of the florists I've tried to get involved want to be creative and show what they can do, and that's not sort of the arrangements that Mr. Eastman really liked. The other thing with regard to music, as so many of you know, he began the Eastman School of Music, and obviously the Eastman Theater as well. And because of that, he was able to bring professors, staff, and students to his home to actually perform or entertain his guests. He had access because, of course, no one wanted to say no to the guy who was funding these two institutions that they worked for. So he kind of had free music. Now, we are fortunate today that I use those same connections by having faculty, students, and even some of our Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra members come and perform at the Eastman Museum every single Sunday throughout the year at 3 o'clock. So this coming Sunday, we have a flautist and a pianist that are coming, and everyone can enjoy their music, but we also have an organ concert the first Sunday of every month, and we have other kinds of trios, quartets, singers, and stuff throughout the year. So I'm delaying as best I can. So, but I would love some of my pictures. So there we go.
Are the concerts free or?
Yes, everything's free with museum admission. And one of the things, because I'm going to move over here while she's doing this, I'll go to my artifacts first before we have the pictures. Got it? So these kinds of orchids, Mr. Eastman grew them in his greenhouses at his home, and he would give these to all the ladies that came for dinner parties, and in particular to 4 ladies called the Lobster Quartet. You're going to see their picture and stuff in here. But obviously, you know, when we get these, especially like for Mother's Day, because that's what they remind me as the kind of orchid I used to give my mom, after you wore them once, people would put them in their refrigerator. And I interviewed one of the Lobster Quartet ladies when I first started my job. And one of the things they said to me, one day I opened my refrigerator and the only thing I had to eat was George Eastman's orchids. Okay, so hopefully now we have our pictures back. So let me go forward. All right, here I am. Oh, okay, let me go back to Mr. Eastman. There you go. So Mr. Eastman built his home in 1905. You can see this is an early photo from his scrapbook. Colonial Revival home, complete with 50 rooms. Way too much to take care of on your own. So he had to have quite a few household staff to help maintain that. And that, in reality, is why he could entertain as much as he did. He didn't have to do all the preparation stuff himself. But you can see here, this is from the early years. You can see the dirt road and the hitching post that you see on your right-hand side. The only other person that lived with him was his mom, and her name was Mariah Kilbourne Eastman. You know, many things are named Kilbourne in our community, and that's all because of her. He wanted to honor her in many ways. Because she was the only person that lived in the house, a lot of things, especially in her room and up in the second and third floors, were very feminine in nature. So she was confined to a wheelchair. When they first moved into the house, she had broken her hip. So an elevator was put into the museum or to his home, which we still use today. I thank God for that every single day with all the visitors we're having for our flower show. People with strollers, walkers, whatever, they can get upstairs in her elevator. And she also loved flowers, so we have many of her choices of flowers that were planted in the gardens. this just gives you an idea of the estate plan. And I'm going to move here for a second. You'll see this gray area. That's the residence. Now, that house is 35,000 square feet of space, 50 rooms. But in relation to everything you see on his estate, oh no, that's not good. Why? Vicki? All right, I don't. So this area here. Oh. I didn't touch it. I'm just pointing. Maybe it doesn't like me to be near it. So let's see if it. Because the point I'm trying to make here is that the residence is the smallest part. All the rest of the gardens, grounds, barn, everything, were all basically so that he could have his own cows, chickens, geese, his own fresh flower garden, so he could do those arrangements in the house, but also so he could have, fresh vegetables and things to cook from, herbs. He grew grapes that I'm sure they made wine with in addition to jelly, but we only have the documentation on those jellies and jams that he used in a lot of different pies. But you can see it's a humongous, sort of estate. East Avenue is here, and University Avenue is there, and the museum still owns all that property today. But we have now made galleries, parking lots, and things like that out of some of those gardens, so not all of them are in complete disarray. This is an aerial photograph showing you his estate, and again, the part up on the top is East Avenue, the part on the bottom is University Avenue. It shows you again the lavish gardens and grounds and the size of his estate, almost 10 acres of land by the time he died. These are some of the household staff. I love this photograph because they're standing right at our porte-cochere door, but they were all dressed for work. The lady that you see here, this is the head housekeeper, and I'm not going anywhere near close to the one with the white hair. That's Molly Sherbalise. The other lady next to her on the right is the laundress. They actually had a laundress, one that just did all your linens and things, then another one that did clothes. And then the cook is right behind, and that gentleman there was the head gardener. Can you imagine working in the garden in a wool suit and a sweater and a tie and a hat? I can't even imagine, but there was an outfit that they were required to wear when they were on the property and interacting with guests or whatever. Mr. Eastman, like he did at his company, had a flow chart for who reported to who in the mansion. So you see the head housekeeper was, I've been told by those that I interviewed when I first started in the 80s that she was like a drill sergeant in the Marines, the way she ran the place. And then you have the chauffeur and his assistant, and then all the people, the butlers, the painters, the carpenters, the cooks, the assistant cooks. And this is my favorite one, the third floor maid. The only thing on the third floor were the rooms where the household staff lived. But they didn't have to clean their own rooms. They were the cook, they were all these other things, so they had a maid for the maids. So they actually had a third floor one that took care of that. You'll see dairy maid, occasional laundresses, occasional cleaners, and then can you imagine literally mowing the lawns without the equipment we have today, but little push lawnmowers. And they were dressed like you saw that gentleman dressed. So quite a few household staff to keep the actual estate functioning on a regular basis. These are a couple, oh no. I don't know why. I'm not moving. I'm trying, unless you want to stand by here and maybe just hold it into the wall, maybe that's it.
I can do that.
Because this is, it's. Now it says no signal, check the cable.
All right. Oh, it's back. I think this is just a little temperamental.
Okay. Well, these are two of his household staff. One of them was the, butler inside and helped him and stuff with his dressing and whatever and stuff. And then the other gentleman and stuff helped around the house as well, and also served kind of as some of his picking people up at the train station and bringing them to the house when he was entertaining. And he did do a lot of that sort of entertaining. Every type of press conference that the Eastman Kodak Company would have, many of them were held in his gardens. So he could film them, he could photograph them, but he had a beautiful place to entertain in. So even for business, he did a lot of that work there. Now, I brought one of these to show you. This was the opening program, okay, in October 7th, 1905. This was his open house. Now, what happened is his mom fell ill, and since she couldn't be there, he knew this a few days in advance, he made it a stag party only. So instead of the women coming with their guys, it was only a guy party, a stag party, 100 men. They each got one of these books. So of course there was no dancing kind of thing at the end. There was a spot for dancing in there. But inside each of these pages was a tipped in, literally glued in photograph of every room or part of the garden you were going to be in for a specific course of the meal, for the drinks, for the toast, for, there was fireworks or whatever and stuff. So I invite you at the end to look through the one. We reproduced it in 1990 when we opened the house fully restored. We couldn't serve all the same, beluga, caviar, and the stuff that Eastman had done, but we tried to serve similar things, so it was kind of like recreating his program. You can see here, the photograph that you see, it says 350 East Avenue. That's a photograph of the front of the mansion. His house changed its address 3 times because as more and more homes were built on East Avenue in other people's property, the addresses had to change. So I have stationery in the collection for 350 East Avenue, 500 East Avenue, and 900 East Avenue, which is what it's known for today. So Mr. Eastman oh no, geez, I was like, I'm looking here, and then I look there, and it's gone. So the picture, if you can get this, is Mr. Byrd. Admiral Byrd was a frequent visitor. A lot of times when, Admiral Perry and other people were trying to get cameras to take on their expeditions to document what they were going to see and find, many of those cameras were given to them personally by Mr. Eastman so that they could basically document their trips and have that sort of proof. So we have letters in the collection from a lot of these explorers. If you can eventually see it, there's a picture of he and George Eastman in the gardens at Eastman House. And of course, one of the things that's consistent in almost all photographs, whether they're posed or just, candid, they're all still smoking cigars and cigarettes. So you can't get rid of it. They're in everybody's hands all the time. Sometimes you even see smoke around their heads when they're being documented.
Let's see. Oh, that's the only part you got.
It's going into sleep.
All right, I'm going to move this one here. If the next picture should be Mr. Eastman with Mary Garden. Now, does anyone in this audience know who Mary Garden is? Anybody? Mary Garden, years ago, sang for the Metropolitan Opera. And Mr. Eastman liked opera, only he liked opera that you sung in English so he could actually understand what the heck was going on. So he started his own Rochester Theater Opera Company here in town. And this is a photo of Mary Garden standing again with Eastman in the front of the mansion. You can see she's also smoking. You can see she has this nice flower that has come from, his garden or whatever and stuff. But I'll tell you one of the funny stories. Because she would come and perform at his home before performing sometime at the Eastman Theater, she would stay for dinner. One day she was wearing a completely black strapless little dress for dinner at Mr. Eastman's home, and he was like asking her, and he did it in front of everyone because it's been documented in a number of letters. He said, "Mary, what is keeping that dress up?" And her answer was, "Mr. Eastman, only your age," is what she said to him. Oh.
I'm just gonna swap tables.
Yes, please do, because
I'm so sorry
it's all right.
about that.
It's all right. There we go. So once he comes back, and then I'll see. Anyway. Okay. So the next one you'll recognize as soon as she gets the picture going. Okay, so there's Eastman and Thomas Edison, and this is what we call the Kodacolor Party in 1928. Mr. Eastman and Edison are announcing that early color motion picture. It was such an expensive process that no one really could afford to buy the camera and the projector and the screen and all that stuff that you'd use a filter on to look like color, but it was announced in Eastman's home in his garden, and it became very popular in Hollywood. They were the ones that took that and started to use it. Thank you very much. I'm hoping.
Let me stick around for a couple.
Okay, good. So, and this is Prince William of Sweden. and his entourage. So they would come, and them as well as people from the royal family in England and various other places where Eastman was sponsoring dental clinics. They would many times visit to thank, him for things when they were coming across to this country or Canada. Why, I have no idea, but every dignitary group is photographed in front of this same door. This is like one of the ugliest doors I've ever seen at Kodak Park, but every single entourage of special guests taking a tour of Kodak Park always stand by this door. And sometimes there's some green on those vines, but most of the time it's just the stone building. We have photo albums filled with the same door and all these different people and stuff, but we know they must have been important, and at least in many cases we know when they visited because they're dated.
Do you know what door it is?
It was on Building 2. So it's an old building in the actual campus kind of thing there, and I hope it's still there. So many of those things have been leveled down, but they have saved some of the original buildings, like the Eastman building where he had his office at Kodak Park is still there. They have beautiful wooden walls and all the aerial photographs of the park, and those have not been touched, but so much of the park has been rented out to other businesses now. So this is a program, and I brought you sort of a copy of it, not the real thing, but this is a program that George Eastman put together for a dinner party at his home when he was hosting the Japanese contingent that came in 1921 to his home. He had gone in 1920 with a group of local businessmen to sort of start getting business going and collaboration and stuff with people in Japan. He was hosting them. So this is a rice paper program with both of the flags on it. And I'll show you the inside here. It says dinner in honor of Viscount Shibusawa and party. Viscount Shibusawa, I can't tell you what car company they're the family of. I get them all mixed up, the Subarus and all that. But it was one of those car companies, and they hosted Eastman when he went the previous year. So he hosted him at his home, took him all around Rochester and to the company, but also took him to Niagara Falls and things like that to sort of show him around. And then, as typical of any dinner party, you would see in the booklet, there would be who the guests are and the various people that he was bringing to introduce them in Rochester, and then the menu of everything they were going to serve, down to Mr. Harold Gleason at the organ. So you'd know there was always music. There were always flowers everywhere, including on the table. Many, if there were women coming, they would receive corsages like those orchids that he grew. And then, of course, there would always be some sort of music to top off the evening. We have many photos of George Eastman taking pictures. This instance, he's in his garden right by the colonnade, and he's actually taking some sort of a movie or whatever. It's from those movies, those photographs, that we are able, thankfully, to restore his home and his gardens as close as possible to what you see here. So the type of vines that are here, the type of window panes that you see, all of these images are used in that way. And he loved taking pictures and movies of his gardens and sending them to friends, people in Europe, people that couldn't travel to be at his home. He was very proud of his gardens, and so regularly documented them and sent them around the world. Now, Mr. Eastman did not marry and have kids, as I mentioned earlier, but he did have family. So the lady you see right here is Ellen Dryden. That is his niece, very much like a daughter to Mr. Eastman. Her college roommate is Nell Newhall, and she's the one there. That's her husband, Charles Newhall. And all these are either Ellen Dryden's kids or the Newhall's kids. Because they lived in the southern tier, whenever Ellen Dryden would come from Evanston, Illinois, all of the Newhalls would descend on the property, and they'd sometimes be there for weeks at a time, especially if it was summer when the kids were on vacation. They could play in their house. George Eastman's house was like their hotel. They had a, place to stay. There were horses they could ride. There was, all kinds of toys and things out in the East Vista for the kids to play with. They had cooks that could actually prepare all their meals, and lovely gardens to hang around in and stuff. You can see here, I've never been able to get this approved by our board, but there was actually a sandbox in the backyard for the nieces and nephews. You can see all the toys that are in here, and you can see some of the hula hoops or the various sort of vintage lawn games that they would have had at the time. But he very much tried to accommodate the little people that were going to be visiting and stuff with his niece and her husband. This was one of the birthday parties he celebrated with the niece and the nephew. Again, that's Nell Newhall. This is George Eastman Dryden, Mariah Eastman Dryden, and that's Watson Newhall. I've been able to meet him when he was in his late 80s or early 90s, and it's from him that many of the stories that I tell come, as well as many of the objects that we have at the museum now have come back from him and his sister's side of the family. One of the things I never understood was what this lady was doing with these ribbons, and it was Miss Holohan at the Rochester Historical Society that told me it was typical when you were celebrating a birthday that some sort of favor would be hidden in the table. Oh, I see some people nodding, and you would pull on the string to pull out your favor. And that's what they were doing, because I was like, those are very long knives or forks or whatever. I couldn't figure out what she was doing, but he hosted a number of parties for the kids at his home. This is another one, and we've recreated this one in the conservatory. They didn't wrap the gifts back then. You came down on either Christmas morning or you came down on your birthday, and at your chair would be your presents, basically. And in this instance, there was something for both the boy and the girl, the ball, the doll. And then there's, what do you call these? Paper clothes for the doll, like a paper, I forget the name of that. What is that? But you could dress your dolls in paper outfits. Yep, there's a whole entire thing filled with different outfits and stuff over there. You'll notice the cake, too. It's obviously somebody's 2 years old with one to grow on. That's the big candle in the middle. But this was a photograph taken in his conservatory, the room where the elephant is now. But these were photographs, and again, all still images, because lighting at the time, probably with kids in the room, probably was going to be difficult. So they took them, they were sort of staged images.
So that's a toy dog?
That's a toy dog. Yes, it is. And actually, that was a ball that I bought, one at an antique thing. It was almost like falling apart and flaking, but I painted it red because it was supposed to be red, and we put it out on display because I was trying to find authentic things that were actually gifts that he gave to people. He didn't always give sort of the most exciting gifts. Like, one of them was an umbrella, another one was a thermos bottle. Like, we would see these on the list, what he was buying for the kids. They did get a train set one year, that went around the tree, but sometimes when I was like trying to find these things to put under the tree, I was like, well, I need a thermos bottle for, it just didn't seem like a typical gift for a kid, but whatever. Maybe they asked for it, but we would have the documentation, and that's the wonderful thing about having all of Mr. Eastman's letters, is because we know where he was going, who he was seeing, how he was entertaining. He wrote to his niece and nephew to get ideas for the kids and things like that. So we have some of it documented. The other thing Eastman did, I would imagine after he became a millionaire, everyone under the sun that had the name Eastman or Kilbourne said they were related to him and were always trying to get money or get a loan. So he paid for a man. He was from the United States, but he went to England, where the Eastmans had come from in 1640 on the ship USS Confidence, and basically had a genealogy done on both the Eastman and the Kilbourne side of the family, so he would know who he was really related to. Then he invited some of the people that were in the Waterville, New York area, close enough in the Cleveland area he had a family, brought them to Rochester, had a little family reunion, and gave them each one of the genealogy. We still, till this day, keep track of all the kids that are now still being had by those relatives, so we could keep it up to date. In fact, one of the interesting things that happens is when someone does die, and more the Eastman side, they will call us and say, look, George Eastman Dryden, so like, what school did he go to and when did he graduate, or what, he won that prize in that yacht race, when was that? So they expect us to have that information for their own families, obituaries. This photo was taken right near the West Garden, where we do a lot of our wedding ceremonies today, and that window you're looking at is the billiard room. So, of course, Eastman had horse and carriages initially, but then he eventually moved into the automobile as well and had his own chauffeur. Eastman was not a good driver. Let's put it that way. He had a license, but he was not good. I have a lot of glass plate negatives of dented fenders and all kinds of accidents that were being documented. I honestly don't know why, because there wasn't really insurance covering that in those early years, but we have tons of hit cars. So I think it was very good that he got a chauffeur. And he had people that were trained not only to take care of the cars, and there were vacuum systems and car washes in his garage to help them to do that, if you can imagine, but also they had a specific way they needed to dress or whatever and stuff while on the job. Now, this particular man named Harvey Paddleford, he gave George Eastman a beautiful, it's sort of a little cigarette and match thing combined, so it's sort of a little pocket thing where you would carry your cigarettes and had a lighter attached to it. Mr. Eastman loved it so because it had his monogram on it that he had somebody in the house make a little silk pouch in red so he would not scratch it when he took it in and out of his pocket. When I first started at the Eastman house, I had the widow of Mr. Paddleford ask me if I wanted the cigarette thing back. So ultimately, it had, when George Eastman died, the Dryden family, his niece and nephew, gave it back to the Paddlefords, and when Mr. Paddleford died, he gave it back to us at the museum. This artifact had come full circle. It's now on display in the second floor of the mansion, and it still has some of his original Lucky Strike cigarettes in it. There's 4 of them in there, and they're all the ones from the Green Pack, you know, the ones from the war. Those are the ones that he smoked and stuff. But it's interesting that some of the people that you see in these slides were really some of the ways we got a lot of things returned that they had taken or that they had been given by relatives of the family as keepsakes, but they eventually returned them to the museum. That's why we have them on display today. One of the things Mr. Eastman was very big on was a formal invitation. I would imagine he spent a lot of money at Scranton's. Anybody remember that store? All right, so we have a number of receipts from there. But he would have the thing printed out for the date, the time, and the place of the party, but then he would handwrite who he was having in. This says Mr. and Mrs. Durfee. It's not all that clear, and this one is Mr. and Mrs. Durfee. So it says, Mr. George Eastman will be happy to see Mr. and Mrs. Durfee on the evening of Thursday, the 1st of January, 1914 at 9 o'clock for dancing at 900 East Avenue. And we have many things on the Durfee, so they must have been regular guests because we have dance programs, we have invitations, we have acceptance cards, things like that. And Mr. Durfee worked at Kodak. I'm not exactly sure what he did, but he did work at the company. Mr. Eastman also kept track of every dinner party that was held at the house. So he made a little bit more of, you know, a splash with the Japanese special thing with the rice paper and all those things. But for every single dinner party, there was always a list of who was going to come, what time it was, and usually on the other side, what they were going to serve. I don't know that he always planned the meals. I believe his head housekeeper did. But as he got older and a little heavier, he would say, no gravy, no sauce. Like he would put things on there so she would have to change it. It still would be the meat, the vegetables or whatever, but not all those fattening things or whatever. So you'd still have his sort of comments on some of these planned menus. But you can see we know who attended because these typed up lists. I didn't bring it today because I would have had to have done some major paperwork with the registrar's office, but Eastman had a beautiful black leather binder that says dinner record, and it has his initials on it. Inside each page was a sort of diagram like this. You would have the date, the time, the place, but he could decide how he wanted his guests to sit around his dining room table. And sometimes it's clear cut like this, other times it's all crossed off, like he had some kind of agenda of who was going to sit next to who he wanted to talk to the other. But it's from these things, and you can see here, George Eastman is here, Mrs. Mulligan, Mr. and Mrs. Reese were regulars. They were from the University of Rochester. The Gleasons were regulars. That was his organist. Then also the Whipples, who were involved with, the University of Rochester, the medical school. The Hubbles, that was his lawyer. So there were good friends, but he also had his doctors, all kinds of people involved at the Eastman School, Eastman Theater, the hospitals, the dental things. It was sort of a rotating list of people that would come for these dinners. And you see on the bottom it says music. There was almost always music and some sort of special program. Here's another one. And again, I like that George Eastman and Mrs. Whipple seem to sit next to each other quite regularly. I was looking through these to decide which ones to put in. I was like, well, there's a lot of the same one. So he seemed to always put her by his side and then kind of mix everyone else up. But it gives you a good idea of who he was regularly entertaining. This is a view of his dining room from his time period. You can see it's in black and white. That table now is it's the smallest it can be. It has like 4 chairs around it. That table can be expanded to seat 22 people for a formal dinner. And if he had more than that, he put them down along the colonnade on round tables, so he could fit even more. But this, for the dining room, it could seat 22. He also loved wine, and particularly Pomeroy Sec was his favorite sort of champagne. It's very dry. I never have a full bottle on display. It's an empty bottle somebody's donated, because we don't have that kind of money in the budget to buy the real champagne, but we do have some empties that are down in there. This is his wine cellar, and he had a wine cellar for both reds that would be a little warmer, and then for whites that he would keep a little bit cooler. As I mentioned, in his time period, music was always a part of any kind of entertaining. And you can see in this picture, his Steinway piano is on the right, and those little chairs with music stands are set up for whatever quartet or trio might be accompanying the pianist. Many of these, as I mentioned, would be staff or faculty or even students at the Eastman School of Music. This is exactly how I set it up when we do Sunday music in the mansion. We use those same chairs and music stands and the Steinway piano. It is his original, and so that's why we keep it in playable condition. These are some of the music programs, and I did bring a couple of them to show you. His monogram, or GE, in sort of block letters, is on the back. You can see here there's a piano quartet, another piano quartet, then violin, cello, and piano and organ, then the organ, violin, cello, and piano, and then strings, organ, and piano. Changed all the time. The only thing you don't see on his programs is a lot of Bach. For whatever reason, he felt that that was kind of melancholy and sad, and he didn't like to listen to it or whatever. And if Harold Gleason or his other organist would try to put some in, he would always catch them. He always said he was a musical moron, but he knew when they were playing the stuff he didn't like, and he would call him on it. So, now we have restored the pipe organ as best we can. It's an Aeolian pipe organ. You can see here our resident organist, Joe Blackburn, is playing. We usually do organ music the first Sunday of every month, and we have a rotating group of organists that play. In the 1949, just before we were going to open, there was a fire in one of our organ chambers. And so many of the pipes in that chamber burnt. So for years, no one ever thought we could ever put back that organ chamber. Thanks to Joe and his constantly playing on the internet, he found a gentleman in California who was actually trying, I think it was his wife who was actually trying to get rid of the pipe organ in his home, but he had to go along with it because they needed to sell their home and move to a smaller quarter. So Dr. and Mrs. Ziff donated all the pipes for our north organ chamber and actually paid for them to come across country in a big tractor trailer, and then Parsons Pipe Organ in Canandaigua helped us to refigure them in the north organ chamber. So now we have stereo sound, just like Eastman did. The north chamber plays to the one side and the north to the other, so when he sits in the conservatory at his breakfast table, he has stereo sound. When you come and you listen to the organ music, if you're around the conservatory, you can also sense and feel the difference and stuff when you're in that space. Here's some more music programs. We actually show the students at the Eastman School these programs. Only a few have ever actually completely reproduced the program, because some of the pieces of music are a little more difficult or something they're not used to, but we have had some come. Students are actually graded by their performance at Eastman House. Their professors are usually in the audience, and they get a grade because they have to introduce the pieces, they have to say a little something about the composer, they do the piece, and also just interacting with visitors who don't always know when to not clap, you know what I mean, because they're not done, but it's that kind of practice in the community that's very important. So we also know what types of organ rolls and records Mr. Eastman had. There was a list. I'm not exactly sure who put these lists together, whether it was the inventory company after his death of this is what they found in the house, organ rolls, records. But these lists have helped me to find vintage pieces of music or records that we didn't have in the collection to bring back so that we can play them. All of the 33 record albums, so to speak, have been digitized, so we now have them on CDs that we can play in the mansion. And you can see here we have an organ roll player. So Eastman had the ability, since he did not play the organ or the piano, he always brought people in to play. If he wanted music when he wasn't entertaining, he could pop in an organ roll. And years ago, he actually had a player piano in the billiard room. We don't have that now, but he could do that. All of the red boxes you see here are not original rolls, because all the original rolls we have are so fragile that if you run them through, the paper rips when they rewind. So we don't want to destroy them. We've actually reproduced these, the same song, so we can play them for our visitors. And then this just gives you a little bit of an idea of what he did when he did a flower show. I think these are all lilies, so it's probably Easter. He was known to cover the entire organ bench and the organist. He didn't like watching or hearing the movement of the pedals and the things there, so this covered that all up and probably closed basically some of the noise of that to him, because he would eat at that breakfast table. And you can see he moved his piano around. I don't do that. It stays in the living room, because every time you move it, you have to tune it again or repair something, so we just leave it alone. It always stays in the living room. But he moved all the instruments around to basically make it work for his entertaining and his parties. I brought a couple of flyers. This sort of reminds me that we do have our flower show Dutch Connection on until Sunday. The house is literally filled with over 2,000 flower bulbs. So if you have an allergy, do not come before Sunday. If you don't have an allergy, please come and enjoy the flowers, because a lot of things will be removed by Monday of next week. This gives you an idea of how Mr. Eastman did the flower show. He got this idea while bicycling through Holland or the Netherlands. He saw all the beautiful color flower fields, decided to order a lot of these bulbs, force them in his greenhouses, and then put them on display for his friends and family. And that's why we do the flower show each February. We call it the Dutch Connection. Basically, we stopped ordering the same types of flowers and plants that Eastman did in reality, because they don't make those same ones anymore. It's harder and harder to get the things from the past. They've all been rebred, but we do some of the same colors, and we do a different display each year. This shows you his breakfast setup in the conservatory, where the organ is, straight in front of you, covered by the flowers. You can see his newspaper sort of thrown on the floor and a tablecloth. Usually when eating by himself or having his first breakfast meeting of the day, he would always use a tablecloth. After, in the afternoon or evening, there would be the painting on the table and the glass cover that you would actually sit on. In this particular photograph, obviously it's all posed because he's not sitting there, but he was known to do these breakfast meetings for people who wanted to get money from him. The people would take the train from New York City, come to our station, I don't know, whatever time, 7 in the morning, 7:30, whenever the train arrived. The chauffeur would pick them up. They would come to Eastman's home. They would have breakfast with him. Now, they had to compete with the guy playing the organ in the room, because that was part of the routine, but they had that 1 hour during breakfast to give them their pitch, to try to see if they could convince him to give them money. The one great thing about that was that you always got an answer from Mr. Eastman then. You didn't have to wait like so many of us do today when we write a grant 3 months before we hear back if it was successful or not. He pretty much made his decision from the conversation, and probably he had done some research before you even got there. Now, these 4 ladies are known as the Lobster Quartet. I brought a closer photograph for you to actually look, and a color photograph of me recreating that luncheon in the mansion. The 4 ladies were all married women, so it was socially acceptable for them to come to lunch at Mr. Eastman's home every Saturday. Now, they got lobster and whatever other accoutrements or, breads and whatever as part of the lunch, and they listened to music. So Mrs. Gleason, who is over here, is the wife of the organist. So he's playing the organ, he's working, but she's getting to have lunch, and she usually gets one of these beautiful flowers to take home or whatever. But they couldn't get their photograph in the conservatory. It would be too dark, and it had to be set up in advance with flash. So they usually went outside. All the photos I have of them are always taken outside in the garden. And that's what you see here. These were the same ladies that got the beautiful orchids. They got basically a lovely lunch. And in my mind, Eastman loved just learning about how everyday people lived. He loved when they wore these dresses. He wanted to know, was that the fashion of the time? He wanted to know what magazines they read, because those would be the magazines he would advertise in for women to take pictures, okay? He knew that was the market he was after, people who were sentimental, want to document their kids growing up, all the special times in their life. So in many ways, but he also would hear about their plumbing problems and all kinds of issues with their kids and things, and I think he just liked it. In fact, one of them, in one of the interviews on Genesee Valley Memory, said, you know, a couple of times he would even almost doze at the table, but he just loved their company. So one day he said to them, I think you ladies only come and socialize with me because I feed you lobster. So they said, well, okay, the next week we're going to each make our own sandwiches and bring them, one for you kind of thing or whatever. So they did. The following week, this sort of grossed me out, but I guess back then they wrapped their sandwiches in newspaper. Yeah, it's like so. But when she told me that in the interview, I was like, are you kidding me? You know, so maybe the newspapers were done a little different back then, but that's what they used as a wrapping. They brought a sandwich for Mr. Eastman. They ate the sandwiches or whatever. Then he told his butler, you know, they've been a good sport, bring on the lobster. And so then they had another whole lunch afterwards as well. But he really did love these ladies. And in many instances, I believe he also used them to test out equipment. He would give them the new upcoming brownie to try out, give them the thing, and if they would complain about this, that, or the other thing, he would know it wasn't usable by everyone. He needed to change the manual or the instructions or whatever. So in many ways, they were his first sort of like people trying things out, sort of the models and stuff like that. If it worked, great. If not, he heard complaints from them, and he told his people in research to work on it.
What were the other names?
So there was a Mrs. Gleason, this is, I believe, Mrs. Whipple, Catherine Whipple. Then Mrs. Gleason, then there was Mrs. Nan Bain Jones, and what was the last one? Oh, Marion Folsom.
Are any of the Gleasons from Gleason Manufacturing? They were friends?
Oh, yeah.
Well, actually, two different types of Gleasons, two different Gleasons. So, but Marion Gleason in this picture went on to be extremely famous for creating a list of poisons that you would find in your home, and it's still a list that's still used till this day. Amazing woman, and all of these, like I said, have their own little history, but again, socially acceptable for them all to come because they were all married women and to people that Mr. Eastman socialized or did business with, or else this would have been really not good at that time period. So this is how I set up the Lobster Quartet luncheon. One of the things, the table, as you saw for breakfast, is covered with a tablecloth, but this one is never covered. I found out that the ladies never wanted to eat in this one section of the painting on this table. It's a section of a sea monster eating a leg of somebody that was on the Nina Pinta in Santa Maria. For years, I had cleaned that table. We had had a conservator fix the painting. I had never, ever noticed that sea monster until the interview. And then I went down and looked at the table. Yep, there it was in the corner. Unless you were really looking for it, you wouldn't notice it. But she said all the ladies always tried to move around. Nobody wanted to sit and eat their lunch next to that particular thing. But you can see this was sort of how it would have been set up in the conservatory. And those were the typical ones. I brought the pink one, but we have two of them. And the white boxes with the lilac tissue was also part of the way he presented these to the ladies at his dinner parties or at various special events at his home. This is Josephine Dickman, and I believe that probably if she was married to George Dickman, who was his London manager, basically at Kodak Harrow, When George Dickman, her husband, died, he made sure that she moved back to Boston, which is where she was from. I credit Mrs. Dickman to really introducing him to the theater and to music and to the fact of a good university education. He visited her a lot in Boston, saw the nice things they had in the arts and culture, and she really convinced him, if you are going to keep people in Rochester, people you're bringing here to this community to work for your company, you need to have some of these things. And so I credit her with really influencing him in a lot of those ways. But in this instance, we have pictures of her in every single garden and in every single room on the first floor of the mansion. And what's funny is that sometimes you'll see the shades are drawn, or he's got the drapes cut. He was trying to find the best way to photograph in these rooms, cutting the light down or adding more light. So she's the only person I have playing pool in the billiard room. Like I said, she's in every single room in every garden, but we have this shot. We know he played pool with friends, but this is the first time you actually see an image of a woman playing the game as well in his billiard room. Games were another thing. He loved cards, poker, contract bridge. We have a checker set, a backgammon set. These are all games he played, afterwards with friends who were there for the evening or dinner. And this is Mary Durand Mulligan. From a lot of gossip, rumors from long time ago, many people believe that Mary Durand and her brother Henry Durand, they were all close friends of George Eastman. Mary Durand was Old Rich. George Eastman was Nouveau Riche. They were friends, but they could not basically marry. And I do believe he really cared for her or whatever. What was funny is that she ends up marrying Dr. Mulligan. All of a sudden, Dr. Mulligan becomes George Eastman's physician. And now they're at dinner every night. They're taking trips together. They're visiting at Oak Lodge. I can't say exactly why that all occurred, but it's just sort of interesting to me how the whole socializing thing always continued late into his life. This is one of the few hand-colored glass plate negatives that we have in the collection. It was of her, and he always kept it as his desk at his home. This is his monogram, the one he used on most of his linens, and I brought a sample of that to show you, but you'll also see it on china, crystal, and all his silverware as well. Now, Mr. Eastman, he had a 40-piece place setting of dishes as well as all these glasses. When I went to the relative's home to actually look at these in catalog, I was like, what do we use some of these things for? I mean, there were 40 different sized glasses. And you think of your white wine, your red wine, your champagne, your, shrimp bowl, your salt bowl. Then I was running out of ideas, juice glass. I mean, there were 40 different pieces. And we have them all. They're all with gold filigree. So, of course, you can't put these in the dishwasher. They all have to be hand done. And now they're all numbered because they're part of our collection. This is his set of china. It's a Minton set of china. So it's got a gold sort of brocade sort of pattern. We have all of the pieces, but we only have a place setting for 8. We only have 8 chairs in the dining room, so there was no need to have any more. And the relatives still have kept some of the set. Anyone want to make a guess what the oval-shaped dish would be used for?
Old dish.
Thank you. Very good. You guys got it. Most of the people to the visitors tell me a croissant or an omelet, or the little kids always tell me it's where you put the banana, because it would fit right away. And all the European visitors yell at me for having it on the table because in their country and culture, it's the salad dish and would come after the meal. It would not be on the table. So it's interesting to just talk to people about how people entertain in setting the table.
So what's the answer? I didn't hear the answer.
Oh, sorry. A bone dish. So when you were eating chicken, turkey, or fish, you put all of your bones or whatever over there. Every kind of conceivable silver thing from, like the typical salt and pepper shakers, but we have grinders, all sterling silver and all with his same GE monogram. And this story I wanted to tell you because he did not put his initial on these cards. A friend of his from Schenectady who worked for General Electric got them as a gift as one of their promotional things and gave it to him because it was the same monogram so he could use them at his card table. And then I set this up one time. This was contract bridge. I didn't know how to play it, but I got a volunteer who did set up the scorecards, and we put, Mrs. Mulligan playing, across from him or whatever, and then we had fake drinks with fake ice cubes or whatever inside there and stuff to try to set it up as close as we could to what we knew he did when he entertained. Now, this is an odd one. I'm sure all of you have your guests come dressed as specific characters in plays. Right after dinner, you're going to put a little play on for yourself. Well, Mr. Eastman did this on a few occasions. The fact that he would tell them, you're going to wear such and such, he would send them the script in advance. They would have dinner. And then after dinner, he would already have this little stage set. All this furniture is furniture from other rooms in the house that he just moved to make a stage in the conservatory, and then he moved his piano again, and they would have somebody playing the music as people were acting out their parts. So we tried once to, one of the plays he did was called The Secret of Suzanne. Suzanne is really smoking, and she keeps leaving the house to smoke, but her husband thinks she's having an affair because she always smells like smoke. We tried to do that once at the Eastman house, and we set off every alarm. All my guests were outside. So we've decided not to do any of those kinds of things anymore. He could get away with it. As a private residence, he didn't have the alarm system that we do as a museum. And then this is also an interesting one. On New Year's Day of 1914, I showed you that invitation. He built a separate room onto his home. He didn't use any of the rooms in his house. Outside of the conservatory, there's like a patio area. On that patio, he built a room, hardwood floors, all those ivy things, and you'll see in a second, he lit it all up, and then actually has tables and chairs set up for a formal dinner for about 100 people. This was to be a New Year's Day party. This is what it looked like. So I would imagine he didn't use, because that looks like more than 40 people to me. So I think he had to have used some other kind of china and glassware, but you can see how fancy it was with the twinkle lights. We've never gone to this extent in any of our special events or parties. And then the other thing, he took it down within a few days after the party. So he didn't keep it up for a long time. It was intended for that one use and then was taken down. And then we have also reenacted certain things that Eastman did. One of the things he seemed to like was high tea. You would have the little sandwiches or whatever. We have a number of invitations that say that and who he invited. So a couple of times we've set up using his original sterling silver set of tea and coffee we would set up for high tea in the house. That fake little mannequin I borrowed from somebody, I don't even remember who, and we would try to set it up so we could interpret how he entertained at the mansion. The other thing he loved to do was show his home movies. Now, many of these, of course, were silent, but he would take movies when he was at Oak Lodge, his hunting lodge, of people, hunting, whatever, skeet shooting. He would also, when he went to safari in Africa, had those home movies. So he would set up all the little chairs that he had around on his porch and in the conservatory in his third-floor screening room. You can see the projector is set up here. And have the reels, and that little screen was used basically to show the movies to his friends. So that was also part of the entertaining. After dinner or maybe after a game of billiards on a specific night, you would watch some of the movies from his trips and his travels. This is Oak Lodge, his hunting lodge in North Carolina, and this is a place he did a lot of entertaining. When he went there, he didn't stay just like we would a long weekend or a week or two. He would be there a couple of months, and they would do a lot of hunting, and he would bring different couples, different friends to the lodge with him, and this was the typical gift. They would have all these raccoons, I guess, that were killed, and they would make this blanket. We have one example sitting on the couch in the billiard room, but he would present it to the couple who was there for their very first time. They would get that as a souvenir.
Is that still just?
Oak Lodge, no. Oak Lodge, it was inherited by his niece and nephew, and it burnt down sometime in the 50s. So it was at that point that the Drydens gave the land to the state of North Carolina, and it's now a park and a reserve. Like there's trails that go through and stuff like that.
Was that near Asheville?
Well,
Because he was friends with the Vanderbilts, right?
well, he knew them, but didn't want to be, he didn't want to be in the Asheville area or in Florida because it was like, he was having to do business with all these people. He wanted to be in a part of, I have never been to the Oak Lodge property. It's in Enfield, it's in Halifax County. It's a good hour or more off of 95 when you get off. A number of my volunteers have gone to check it out. So it isn't near there, but it is still in the state of North Carolina. But it's Enfield and Halifax are on a complete different area from all the wealthy people that lived down in the Asheville area. This is some of his camping things. He was very fanatical about setting up before trips. He would take all this apart, literally put all the tents and things together to make sure he had everything, and then take them all apart and put it in to make sure everything was prepared. This would then be hitched to a car to then take to the train station. It would all be loaded onto the train to then get to North Carolina. And this, you can see here, they're unloading or whatever here. One of the interesting things, Eastman had more than enough money to own his own train car. He never bought his own. So he always rented a Pullman every time he needed it. And he would go from here to, well, New York City to Washington, D.C., and then Washington, D.C., they would sometimes take buckboard things, sometimes they would take another train down to the stop in near Oak Lodge, the one closest. And then his household staff there would greet him with a buckboard and take him the rest of the way. This was some of the dinner things that I told you about. Who accepted the invitation, the menu that was going to be served February 19th of 1918. So we kind of know who he continued to socialize with and people he continued to travel with as well. You can see here he loved to hunt, so you can see some of his dogs, the hunting dogs or whatever here, and even, Mrs. Mulligan, that's her over there. And, again, frequent visitors, you'll also see her at Oak Lodge processing a lot of the pictures that they took of people hunting and doing these activities. And then these are some indoor shots. I mean, again, because photography didn't allow you to get like a lot of action thing, this was definitely posed, but you can see people reading, some are sewing. These would be some of the things they could do to relax at Oak Lodge, his hunting lodge. When he went there, he brought the Dawson-Bach Quintet, a music group, and they had a guest cottage so that they could perform music for him and stuff. He brought many of his household staff from 900 East Avenue with him because he still needed people to cook and to serve. So they sort of traveled and had a vacation as well. They all had guest cottages on this property. And then he did go to Africa twice, and both when he was quite older, I mean, in his 70s, going in an area, and again, I guess that's why you take your doctor with you, right? If anything happens, you got your physician right there, because the doctor traveled with him with 2-3 months at a time, both in 1926 and in 1928. You can see here some of the pictures of their tents and some of their, equipment. We have a number of the camp chairs, tents, the bath tent that he took with him. Here he's literally blowing the egg out of an ostrich egg to make omelets. He loved to do the cooking outside. They didn't like when he tried to cook at Eastman House. The servants said he made a mess and there was just every pot and pan used, basically. But when he could on his own camping and whatever, he did a lot of the cooking. And these are some of the gadgets or the camp containers that he took with him. You'll notice they're all numbered. Many of them all have a GE. So when you got off your buckboard or off your train or off your ship in Africa, you had to count and look if you had 1 through 10 with all the initials on, so you made sure you had all your equipment and nothing was left behind. This was all him. All that detail sort of stuff and planning was all sort of the personality and the mindset of Mr. Eastman. This is one of the foodstuff cabinets. Your flour, your lard, all the things you would need to be able to bake bread, muffins, pancakes while you were traveling in Africa. There were no 7-Elevens back then to stop and pick it up, and definitely no Uber or DoorDash to bring you what you hadn't decided to take with you. And then this is one of my favorites. He loved picnics. So back then when you had a car, you had to crank it up. It would only go so far. When it stopped, you stopped. He took the seat out from the back seat, and that's what they're sitting on. He had a little table, a folding table. He had a picnic basket. He would have, that's probably where the thermos came in and all the different cups and saucers. We still have a lot of those things today, but he loved a picnic. They would eat, and then when I don't know if the car had to charge up again, whatever, then you would continue on your way. But he was always prepared, and they actually took many of these vehicles to Africa or to Japan when he went because they couldn't rent a car, so you'd have to bring your own. It was actually put on the ship, and so that's where the removable seats really helped when you needed a place to sit when you were stopping on the side of the road to have a picnic. And then I'll just sort of run through some of these. Because of his love of the organ and music, we keep the organ restored. We play it on a regular basis. We also do a lot with the students at Eastman School. They have a very good organ program, and they come to practice on the organ and then perform on Sundays. I mentioned earlier this area here is now where we have the North organ, the one that came from California from the Zips. So we have not only restored the South organ that we had, but now the North organ that we just got back. So again, the stereo sound can be heard when you're in the room at that table. And then the other thing we did when we restored that is we made it a walkable chamber. So now tours that visit, when it's being played, we can actually walk you through and you can see everything moving and shaking or whatever. It's loud, but if you want to, you can actually go through and experience what it's like to be inside the pipes. And then I mentioned the monochromatic flowers. I'm just sort of giving you a little idea here. It was very important to him that color was the same, but you could mix the varieties. And then again, his flower show, we've now made it into our Dutch Connection, which we do every single February. That's for Christmas. We do the poinsettias. And then again, a picture of how we do music. When you come, we have seats set up on the two roped off areas, so we can usually seat about 35 or 40 people for the live music. And then we also do garden concerts now. He did some music, but he definitely did not do steel drum and some of the more modern things, Irish folk, dancing kind of thing, but we try to attract different audiences by doing those outside in the garden in June, July, and August. And then you can see here, that's some of our garden vibe. People come and actually bring picnics. We have, food trucks or whatever there to buy food, but a lot of people do a lot of tailgating in our garden. And then, of course, we decorate as he did for the holidays. I still thank God for the fire marshal who told me a number of years ago, you're keeping the lights on in these real greens too long. It's drying out, could be a fire hazard. I bought him a whole tray of cookies, so now I could use artificial things that I don't have to replace year after year, and they have lasted. But these are original ones, real greens that you see. We always used to do it authentically with fruit and cones and real greens, but they make a mess, as you all know, and they drip sap and whatever, so it's now better to have artificial that we use and try to do it as vintage as we can to the way Eastman lived. But now we also do a tabletop tree display, wreaths, as well as gingerbread display that I'm sure you have seen. This is the sitting room where you can see some of those displays. The Christmas tree in the living room that we decorate with a lot of the vintage glass ornaments that we have from his time. And then this is also where people will see Santa on the Thursday 2 weeks before Christmas. And that's my last slide, talking about how all the different things we do about Eastman at the house are a way to teach about him, his personality, his time period in which he lived, and to sort of keep his legacy alive. Now I'd be happy for at least 5 minutes to address some questions. So before they kick us out. Are there questions I can answer? Yes?
Tell about the turntable for the car.
Sure, I can. So in Mr. Eastman's carriage house, he had the ability to first bring in your carriage and then a turnstile that would turn it around so it was ready to hitch the horses to it so you could go right out. When those became old-fashioned and he had automobiles, you could pull your car in and then it could be turned around so you never had to back up. You could just drive out. When we were doing the renovation of our new entrance, I went down with my hard hat and my mask while they were drilling the floor because I was really hoping to find sort of some of the remnants of what that turnstile was. We have a drawing of it in the collection and how much he paid for it, but we couldn't really find sort of the outline of where that would have been. We kind of thought we would find it, but we really didn't. So, but it is a true story, and he did have it in the mansion. Other questions? Yes?
Who's going to replace you?
Well, that still needs to be determined. A successor will be hired, I hope, by the end of March or early April, but it takes a long time to really understand the Eastman story, understand sort of what he meant to the community, interview and talk to him. I mean, so many of my stories come from oral histories that I did with people that worked for him at the company, worked for him at his home, from his relatives and family members, that kind of thing. And now most of them are gone. Yeah, even Betsy Brayer, who did the research for her book, the biography on Eastman, even she has passed away. And it's really awkward being the only person that can answer questions on stuff like that. So I am hopeful some of the new people we've hired to work on some new exhibits will also be able to sort of share in that. They'll have a different perspective being younger, and I think it will be very good to continue keeping his legacy alive in different ways. Yes?
This is not a question, it's an observation. If it hadn't been for George Eastman, I would not be here tonight. Which
Yep.
is not to say I was his great-grandson. But the reason I'm here tonight is because in 1937, my father, who graduated from medical school and dental school in the 30s,
So he came.
out of the Depression with no money, was an intern at the Eastman Dental Dispensary, which is on Main Street.
Well, was on Main Street. Now it's Eastman Gardens. It's an apartment complex for seniors. But
And my mother and father lived, well, actually, they got married secretly because my mother had a job and my father did not have a job, and they owed $1 gazillion in debt for going to medical school, etc. In any event, they lived on Alexander Street, and my father was at the Eastman Dental Dispensary. And they drove out to Fairport. And there was a dentist out here in Fairport who was ready to retire.
and so they took over.
And there was an opportunity. And Dr. Welch's office was across the street. And he said, Dr. Whitney, if you will take over my office and my practice, you can move into across the street and take the office, and that there happens to be an apartment across the street where you and the new Mrs. Whitney can live.
Wow, that's neat.
And that was in 1937. I was born in 1938.
And so, have you stayed in Fairport this whole time too? Yeah, so she still does. Yeah.
And George Eastman had a huge impact on this community. There are probably a lot of other people in this room that can make that same statement. They would not be here but for George Eastman.
No, that's true. Well, he did bring so many different people into the community for his business. Yeah.
That's what triggered it.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, we have, okay, there's one more question?
Which room on the third floor, his projection room, like what's the use now?
It's the director's office, yeah. And so the screen is still there. You can actually, but if you pull it down, you are really having a hard time getting it back up. But the screen is still there for showing the movies. And, you can still see the tile on the floor and the walls, but it's now the director's office. So, oh, yes.
What was the name of the woman he hired to run his company?
Well, Alice K. Whitney Hutchison, you mean? His secretary for 40 years? Yeah, she is who I credit for saving all of the letters. All of the original letters from him from 1880 through 1932, even a little after his death, she continued to close up the office even after he had killed himself. So he basically was gone in March of 32. She stayed at least 3 more months, closed up his office, but made sure all of those letters were saved, had them put in these leather-bound volumes, which we still use today. They're all carbon copies in blue. But we have digitized them, and that's how we can look things up and do word searches and stuff in the collection. It was because of her really thinking it was important enough for those things to be saved. Yeah. Thank you so much for your attention, and come and look at the objects there.
I was going to ask you, did you know Betty Hallahan?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it
Because
was.
I took care of her sister-in-law, so I knew